Have you ever poured your entire soul into building a life only to have the foundation shattered by the one person who promised to hold it steady? My story began on what should have been a celebration, but became the day my world imploded. Stay with me, and perhaps you'll find echoes of your own resilience in the ashes of what was. The crystal glass felt cold against my palm, a stark contrast to the simmering heat of humiliation rising in my chest. 40 years. We were celebrating 40 years, Richard and I, in the ridiculously expensive restaurant he'd chosen. The kind with hushed tones and waiters who materialized like ghosts. He'd just presented me with a diamond necklace, heavy, ostentatious, nothing like the delicate silver pieces I truly loved. He'd always bought what he thought a successful man's wife should wear. And then, as I fumbled with the clasp, trying to muster a convincing smile, he leaned forward, his voice low but clear, slicing through the expensive ambience like a shard of ice. "Amelia," he said, his eyes, the eyes I had loved for 4 decades, holding no warmth, only a chilling finality. "I have to be honest. Marrying you, it was the biggest regret of my life. 40 years wasted, tethered to someone who never truly understood ambition, who held me back." He took a sip of his wine, oblivious or perhaps reveling in the way my breath hitched, the way the room seemed to tilt. My name was Amelia Weston, soon to be just Amelia, apparently. For 40 years I had been Mrs. Richard Weston, the supportive wife, the gracious hostess, the silent partner in his relentless climb up the corporate ladder. I'd shelved my own modest dreams, a small art studio, perhaps, believing his ambitions were our shared future. Now, under the glare of judgmental chandeliers, with strangers pretending not to listen, he casually dismantled that shared future, brick by painful brick. The necklace felt like a lead weight around my neck. The shock was a physical blow, stealing the air from my lungs. Disbelief warred with a sickening certainty. This wasn't a cruel joke. This was Richard, calculated, decisive, and utterly ruthless when it suited him. He continued, outlining his plans for a new chapter, mentioning someone younger, naturally, someone more aligned with his current status. Each word was a perfectly aimed dart, puncturing the carefully constructed illusion of our life together. Hurt, raw, and blinding washed over me. I felt exposed, stripped bare not just of my marriage, but of my identity. Who was I, if not his wife? He finished his speech, patted my hand with counterfeit sympathy, and signaled for the bill. The performance was over. My world had ended between the appetizer and the main course. The drive home was silent, a thick, suffocating blanket of unspoken words and shattering realities. Richard hummed tunelessly, already inhabiting his new life, while I sat beside him, a ghost in my own car. Our house, usually a sanctuary of ordered calm, felt cavernous and cold. He didn't help me out of the car. He didn't look back. Inside, he went straight to his study, closing the door with a soft click that echoed like a gunshot in the stillness. I stood in the marble entryway, the diamond necklace still heavy around my neck, feeling utterly adrift. Where did I even begin? My mind raced, trying to grasp the enormity of it. 40 years of shared memories, compromises, quiet joys, and hidden sorrows, all dismissed as a regret. I drifted numbly towards our bedroom, the room where we'd raised our children, shared secrets, weathered storms. Or so I thought. His suitcases were already packed, standing sentinel by the door. Not mine, his. He wasn't leaving. He was expecting me to leave. The cruelty of it was breathtaking. My phone buzzed. A notification from the bank. Joint account access denied. He'd moved swiftly, clinically cutting me off. Panic began to claw at the edges of my shock. I had no money of my own, not really. My small inheritance had been absorbed into our finances years ago. I sank onto the edge of the bed, the plush velvet suddenly feeling alien. My eyes fell on my old writing desk in the corner, a relic from my youth that I'd insisted on keeping. I opened a drawer, fingers tracing the familiar grain of the wood. Tucked beneath old sketchbooks filled with forgotten dreams was a letter. Thick cream paper, folded neatly, addressed simply to myself. I'd written it nearly 35 years ago, newly married, full of hopes but also nascent anxieties about losing myself in Richard's shadow. It spoke of my desire for a small seaside cottage, for time to paint, for a life measured in quiet contentment rather than acquisitions. I'd never sent it, never even reread it. Holding it now felt like finding a map to a country I'd forgotten existed. A wave of desolate clarity washed over me. I wouldn't beg. I wouldn't fight for the hollow shell of this life. He regretted marrying me? Fine. Let him have his regret and his house and his money. I stood up, a fragile resolve solidifying within me. I took off the diamond necklace, leaving it on his pristine pillow. I changed out of my expensive dinner dress into simple trousers and a sweater. I packed a small bag, essentials, my old sketchbooks and the letter. As I walked towards the front door, Richard emerged from his study. He held out an envelope. "Here," he said, his tone brisk, dismissive. "Enough for a few months. Find yourself a small apartment somewhere." Pity money. I looked at his hand, then into his cold eyes. "No, thank you, Richard," I said, my voice surprisingly steady. "I'll manage." I walked out the door, leaving behind 40 years of life and the man who considered it all a waste. The only thing I took of value besides my dignity was a pair of pearl earrings, a gift from my own grandmother. They felt real, unlike the diamonds. Outside, the night air was cool. I walked to the nearest pawn shop, the light seeming garish and unwelcoming. Selling my grandmother's pearls felt like another betrayal, but it was a necessary one. The cash was meager, but it was mine. It was the price of my first step away, my first choice made solely for myself in decades. The weight of the loss was immense, but beneath it, a tiny spark flickered, the terrifying, exhilarating spark of freedom. The bus station was a cacophony of sounds and smells, a world away from the manicured silence of my former life. Fluorescent lights buzzed overhead, casting a sickly glow on worn linoleum floors and rows of hard plastic seats. Exhausted travelers slumped with their luggage, their faces etched with fatigue or anticipation. I bought a ticket for the longest route heading towards the coast, a destination plucked randomly from the departure board, the name sounding remote and unimportant, Saltwind Bay. It felt right. I needed distance, anonymity, the cleansing power of the sea I'd always dreamed of. The journey itself was a blur of rattling windows, stale air, and fleeting glimpses of unfamiliar landscapes. Fields gave way to towns, towns blurred into highways, hours bled into each other. I clutched my small bag, the edges of the old letter pressing against my palm through the thin fabric. Sleep offered no escape, my mind replaying Richard's words, his cold eyes, the closing of the study door. Each mile put physical distance between us, but the emotional wreckage felt like a physical weight inside me. When the bus finally wheezed to a stop in Saltwind Bay, it was late afternoon. Rain lashed against the windows, driven by a fierce coastal wind. The station was little more than a dilapidated shelter by the side of a windswept road. As I stepped off the bus, the salty air hit me, sharp and bracing, carrying the cries of unseen gulls. The town huddled against the grey churning sea, a collection of weathered cottages and small shops clinging to a rocky shoreline. It looked rough, unpolished, utterly indifferent to my arrival. There were no welcoming lights, no friendly faces, just the relentless wind and rain. I pulled my thin coat tighter, shivering. The meager cash from the pawned pearls felt impossibly small in my pocket. I found a guest house near the harbor, the paint peeling, a flickering vacancy sign barely visible through the downpour. The room was tiny, damp, and smelled faintly of mildew and old fish. The single bulb cast weak shadows on the thin, worn blankets. Lying on the lumpy mattress, listening to the wind howl like a mournful beast, I felt the crushing weight of my situation settle upon me. I was 60-something years old, penniless, homeless, and utterly alone in a place I didn't know, with no plan and no one to call. The vulnerability was terrifying. This wasn't the seaside cottage of my youthful dreams. This was rock bottom. Tears I hadn't allowed myself to shed finally came, hot and silent, soaking the musty pillowcase. Was Richard right? Was I just adrift, worthless without him? The despair felt absolute, a cold tide threatening to pull me under. The next morning dawned grey and brittle, the rain having subsided to a persistent drizzle. Hunger gnawed at me, a stark reminder of my precarious reality. I forced myself out of the grim guest house, the damp chill clinging to my clothes. My head ached, my body felt heavy with exhaustion and unshed grief. I wandered towards the harbor, drawn by the rhythmic clang of rigging against masts and the cries of gulls scavenging for scraps. The salty air, though cold, felt cleaner, somehow more honest than the perfumed sterility of my old life. Fishermen in oilskins were mending nets, their faces weathered like the landscape, their movements practiced and economical. No one paid me any attention, lost in their own routines. I clutched the few remaining notes in my pocket, calculating how long they might last. Panic tightened its icy grip again. What was I doing here? How could I possibly survive? I leaned against a damp stone wall near the fish market, the rough texture grounding me for a moment. The smell of brine and fish hung heavy in the air. Suddenly, the world swam. The exhaustion, the lack of food, the emotional turmoil. It all converged. My knees buckled. I remember a sensation of falling, the hard cobblestones rushing up to meet me, and then darkness. When I surfaced, it was to the smell of wood smoke and something warm and savory. I was lying on a surprisingly comfortable sofa, covered by a thick hand-knitted blanket. My head throbbed dully, but the crushing despair had receded slightly, replaced by confusion. I blinked, taking in my surroundings. I was in a small, cozy room, behind what looked like a shop. Shelves lined the walls, filled with colorful yarns, handmade pottery, driftwood sculptures, and intricate pieces woven from seagrass. A woman with kind eyes, framed by laugh lines and a cascade of silver hair tucked into a messy bun, was watching me, stirring something in a pot on a small stove in the corner. "Ah, you're awake," she said, her voice gentle, carrying the soft lilt of the coast. "Gave us quite a scare out there, collapsing like that. Drink this, it'll help." She ladled steaming broth into a mug and carefully handed it to me. Her hands were work-worn but steady. I managed a weak, "Thank you." My voice was raspy. "I'm Martha," she offered, pulling up a stool. "This is my little shop. Found you near the market. You looked like you could use a bit of warmth." There was no judgment in her eyes, only concern. I sipped the broth. It was simple, flavorful, and incredibly comforting. Tears pricked my eyes again, but this time from gratitude. This stranger, Martha, had offered help without question. We sat in silence for a while, the only sounds the gentle bubbling of the pot and the distant cry of gulls. She didn't pry, didn't ask intrusive questions. She simply provided a safe harbor, a temporary sanctuary from the storm raging inside me. The feeling of safety, however fleeting, was profound. After 40 years of conditional acceptance, this quiet, unconditional kindness felt like a miracle. Maybe, just maybe, I hadn't reached the absolute end. Survival became my immediate focus. Gratitude was warm, but it wouldn't pay for food or shelter. After ensuring I was steady on my feet, Martha offered me a simple meal, thick bread, cheese, and more of the restorative broth. As we ate in the cozy back room of her shop, the Salty Weaver, I felt compelled to explain, at least partially. I didn't pour out the whole sordid story of Richard's betrayal, but I admitted I'd left a difficult situation, had very little money, and needed to find work, any work. Martha listened patiently, her gaze thoughtful. "Things wash ashore here all the time," she said cryptically, looking around her shop filled with treasures reclaimed from the sea and transformed by her hands. "People too, sometimes, needing a place to mend." She paused, then added, "I could use some help around the place if you're willing. It's not glamorous. Sweeping, sorting deliveries, keeping the shelves tidy. I can offer you the small attic room upstairs and simple meals, plus a little bit of pay when things pick up." It was more than I could have hoped for. "Yes," I said immediately, relief washing over me. "Thank you, Martha. I'm willing to work hard." And so began my apprenticeship in resilience. The work was hard. My body, accustomed to a life of relative ease, protested loudly. Muscles I hadn't used in decades ached. My hands, once soft and manicured, became roughened, calloused. I swept floors gritty with sand, unpacked heavy boxes of yarn and clay, learned the meticulous process of cleaning and sorting driftwood and sea glass that Martha used in her art. There were days I felt clumsy, inept, frustrated by my own limitations. I, who had once managed caterers for Richard's corporate galas, struggled to properly organize dusty shelves. But Martha was patient, correcting gently, offering quiet encouragement. She taught me practical skills, how to properly bank the fire in the stove, how to identify different types of local wood, how to make a decent pot of tea. More than that, she taught me the value of quiet industry, the dignity of manual labor. As I worked, surrounded by the tangible results of creativity and effort, something began to shift within me. The physical exertion was grounding. Focusing on simple, necessary tasks quieted the relentless loop of hurt and humiliation in my mind. One afternoon, while sorting a delivery of sea-worn pottery shards, my fingers instinctively began arranging them, noticing the subtle shifts in color and texture. A forgotten echo of my old artistic impulse stirred. I started sketching again in the evenings, tentatively at first, using the back of old invoices, capturing the shapes of shells, the pattern of light on the water, the character in the weathered faces I saw around town. It wasn't about ambition or recognition. It was about reconnecting with a part of myself I thought long dead. The work was demanding, the room basic, the pay negligible, but each day I managed, each task I completed, chipped away at the feeling of helplessness Richard's betrayal had instilled. I was learning to stand on my own 2 feet, literally and figuratively, building strength not from wealth or status, but from effort and adaptation. Slowly, tentatively, the rhythm of Saltwind Bay began to seep into my bones. Life here moved with the tides, dictated by the weather and the seasons. I fell into a routine. Early mornings helping Martha open the shop, the smell of brewing coffee mingling with the salty air. Afternoons spent sorting, cleaning, or attempting small repairs under Martha's guidance. Evenings often quiet, sometimes spent sketching, sometimes sharing a simple meal and conversation with Martha by the fire. The initial isolation began to fade as I became a familiar face. Elias, a fisherman with eyes as gray and deep as the winter sea, would stop by the shop with the best of his catch for Martha, always offering me a nod and a quiet, "Mornin', Amelia." Sometimes he'd linger, sharing tales of the unpredictable ocean or the history of the town, his voice raspy from salt and wind. Other women, weavers and potters who supplied Martha's shop, or simply neighbors stopping in for yarn and gossip, started including me in their conversations. They didn't ask about my past, accepting my presence with a simple, unforced grace. They saw me working alongside Martha, saw my hands growing capable, saw the slow return of light to my eyes. One day, Ilara, a woman known for her intricate knotwork, admired a small arrangement of driftwood and shells I'd put together for a dusty corner of the shop. "You've got an eye for it, Amelia," she said approvingly. "Brings the wildness right inside." Her simple words of validation resonated deeply, a stark contrast to Richard's constant, subtle dismissal of my interests as frivolous hobbies. Martha, noticing my rediscovered passion, encouraged me. She cleared a small space for me near a window in the back room, a makeshift studio. "Waste not, want not," she'd said, pointing to the piles of sea-found materials. "See what beauty you can coax from what the tide brings in." Participating in small community rituals further cemented my belonging. I helped Martha prepare food for the annual Fisherman's Blessing ceremony, joined the weekly knitting circle. Though my skills remained rudimentary, my presence was welcomed. Learned the local gossip, mostly benign, revolving around fishing quotas and jam recipes. This community wasn't built on wealth or status, but on mutual reliance, shared history, and quiet acceptance. They valued hard work, resilience, and authenticity, qualities Richard had never seen, or perhaps never wanted to see, in me. The genuine connection I felt here, the sense of being seen and valued for who I was becoming, not who I was married to, was a powerful antidote to the poison of Richard's rejection. The supportive environment stood in such sharp contrast to the conditional, judgmental atmosphere of my previous life, highlighting just how much I had contorted myself to fit into Richard's world. Here, I was simply Amelia, the woman who worked at the Salty Weaver, the quiet newcomer with an artist's eye, slowly finding her place. The makeshift studio by the window became my haven. Working with the materials the sea offered, the smooth gray curves of driftwood, the frosted jewel tones of sea glass, the intricate patterns of shells, felt like collaborating with nature itself. My sketches evolved into small sculptures, mosaics, and wall hangings. They were simple, unpretentious pieces, reflecting the raw beauty of the coast and, perhaps, the mending of my own spirit. Martha, ever observant, placed a few of my finished pieces discreetly amongst her own wares in the shop. To my astonishment, they began to sell. First, a small driftwood seagull, then a mosaic tile catching the light, then another. Tourists and locals alike seemed drawn to their quiet authenticity. The first time someone handed me cash, actual money earned from something I had created, was a revelation. It wasn't a vast sum, but it felt monumental. It was tangible proof of my capability, my worth, existing entirely separate from Richard Weston and the life he'd declared a waste. With each sale, my confidence grew. Martha suggested I sign my pieces. Amelia, I wrote tentatively at first, then with growing assurance. Just Amelia. It felt right. That small act of claiming my work, my name, felt like planting a flag on newly discovered territory, myself. The income, though modest, allowed me a measure of independence. I could buy my own art supplies, contribute more meaningfully to the household expenses, even treat Martha to fish and chips from the harborside stall occasionally. It wasn't about luxury, it was about agency. I started to envision a future I hadn't dared to imagine just months before. Perhaps a small corner in a local craft market. Maybe eventually my own tiny studio space filled with light and the smell of the sea. A life built not on the foundations of someone else's ambition, but on my own quiet creativity and resilience. The pain of Richard's betrayal hadn't vanished entirely, but it no longer defined me. It had become the catalyst, the unexpected shove off a cliff that forced me to discover I could, perhaps, fly. Or at least learn to build my own sturdy ladder back up. I looked at my reflection one evening, not in a gilded mirror, but in the shop window reflecting the lamplight. The woman looking back was older, her face lined, her hands rough, but her eyes held a clarity, a calm strength that hadn't been there before. I was no longer just Mrs. Richard Weston, the discarded wife. I was Amelia, an artist, a survivor, a quiet member of the Saltwind Bay community, and for the first time in a very long time, I felt hopeful about the future unfolding before me. The registered letter arrived on a blustery Tuesday morning, the official-looking envelope starkly out of place amidst the usual deliveries of yarn and craft supplies. My heart gave a familiar, painful lurch seeing the return address, Richard's lawyer, divorce papers, so he was finalizing the erasure. Martha was standing nearby, sorting through a tangle of fishing nets she planned to weave into a mat. She saw the look on my face, the way my hand trembled slightly as I held the envelope. "Bad tide coming in?" she asked quietly, her eyes full of understanding. I nodded, unable to speak for a moment. "It's from him," I finally managed. "The official end." We went into the back room and I opened it, sinking onto the stool by my makeshift studio. The legal jargon swam before my eyes. Dissolution, assets, settlement. It was clinical, cold, reducing 40 years to clauses and conditions. He was offering a settlement, a lump sum, more generous than his initial pity money, perhaps realizing I hadn't simply disappeared into destitution as he might have expected, or perhaps just wanting a clean, swift end. A wave of old hurt washed over me, the memory of his face in the restaurant, the casual cruelty of his words. But it was different now. The raw agony had dulled, replaced by a weary sadness and a surprising sense of detachment. This piece of paper felt like an artifact from another life, another world. I looked around the small, cluttered room, my work table scattered with shells and tools, Martha's loom standing sentinel in the corner, the smell of wood smoke and sea salt in the air. This was my reality now. This was where I belonged. Martha sat beside me, patiently deciphering the legalese. "He wants it over quickly," she observed. "No contests." She looked at me. "Are you all right, Amelia?" I took a deep breath, the salty air filling my lungs. "Yes," I said, surprised to find it was true. "Yes, I think I am." The papers represented closure, not a fresh wound. Later that week, news trickled through the coastal grapevine. A well-dressed man asking questions in the pub, driving a car too flashy for Saltwind Bay, mentioning my name. Richard, he was looking for me, not through lawyers, but personally. Why? Had his new chapter hit a snag? Did he need something? Or worse, did he think he could somehow reclaim the compliant wife he'd discarded? The thought sent a flicker of apprehension through me, but it was quickly overshadowed by a quiet resolve. I wasn't that woman anymore. I retrieved the old letter I had carried with me, the one written by my younger self, full of dreams I was only now beginning to realize. I unfolded it carefully, rereading the words penned by a hopeful, uncertain woman 35 years ago. It spoke of finding joy in simple things, of creative expression, of a life lived authentically. Holding it now, I felt a profound connection to that younger self and a deep sense of gratitude for the harsh turn that had, paradoxically, led me back to her. I wasn't afraid of seeing Richard. I was ready, not for a fight, not for revenge, but to simply stand in my truth, the truth I had painstakingly built here, stone by weathered stone, shell by luminous shell. Martha watched me, a knowing look in her eyes. "Roots run deep once they find good soil," she murmured, nodding towards my artwork. I knew she wasn't just talking about the driftwood. He found me a few days later, standing outside the Salty Weaver, arranging a display of my sea glass mosaics in the shop window. The sleek, offensively expensive car pulled up, looking utterly alien against the backdrop of weathered fishing boats and rustic cottages. Richard stepped out, dressed in a tailored suit, his face a mask of composed assurance, though his eyes flickered with something I couldn't immediately place: confusion, annoyance. He looked older, more strained than I remembered. He approached me, stopping a few feet away, taking in my appearance, my simple clothes, my work-stained hands, the calmness in my posture. "Amelia," he said, his voice attempting its old authoritative tone, but lacking conviction. "I've been looking for you. What is this place? This is where you ended up?" There was derision in his tone, a dismissal of everything around me, everything I had become. "Hello, Richard," I replied, my voice steady. I didn't invite him in. I didn't shrink away. I simply stood my ground. "This place is Saltwind Bay, and yes, this is where I live now." He gestured vaguely at the shop, at my artwork. "Living? This? Amelia, be reasonable. I came to... Well, the settlement offer stands, of course, but perhaps we could discuss things. This absurdity has gone on long enough. Come home." Home. The word sounded hollow, meaningless, coming from him. "There's nothing to discuss, Richard," I said calmly. "I received the papers, I'll sign them. And this," I swept a hand towards the shop, the harbor, the life I had built, "is not absurdity. It's my life, the one I chose." He scoffed, a harsh, unpleasant sound. "Chose? You had no choice. I left you with nothing. You landed here out of desperation. Don't pretend this little hobby," he sneered at my mosaics, "is some kind of grand statement." That's when I reached into my apron pocket and pulled out the old folded letter. His eyes narrowed, curious. "What's that?" "This," I said, holding it out, but not letting him take it, "is a letter I wrote to myself 35 years ago. It talks about the life I dreamed of, a quiet life near the sea, filled with art, filled with meaning that had nothing to do with stock prices or impressing your business partners. A life you always dismissed, Richard. A life I'm finally living, thanks to you." I unfolded it, my eyes scanning the familiar words. "You said marrying me was your biggest regret. Perhaps," I looked directly at him, letting him see the quiet strength that had replaced the hurt. "But your leaving me, it inadvertently gave me the freedom to finally pursue the things I wrote about right here, long before you decided I was holding you back." I saw a flicker of disbelief in his eyes, then something else. A dawning, unpleasant realization. He finally seemed to see me, not as his discarded wife, but as a person with her own history, her own desires, existing independently of him. It was then his carefully constructed facade began to crumble. The color drained from his face. He reached out, perhaps to take the letter, perhaps to steady himself, but his hand trembled violently. He staggered back a step, his breath coming in ragged gasps. The dismissal, the regret, the carefully managed narrative of his life, it all seemed to collapse inward as he confronted the tangible evidence of the woman he had never truly seen, the life he had so carelessly fractured, and the unexpected resilience that had bloomed in the wreckage. He leaned heavily against his ridiculous car, his face pale, his eyes wide with a confusion that bordered on panic. Martha had quietly come to the doorway. Elias stood nearby mending a net, their presence a silent, unwavering wall of support behind me. Richard wasn't just facing me. He was facing the community that had embraced me, the life that had nurtured me back to strength. He looked utterly lost, defeated not by anger or argument, but by the quiet, undeniable truth of my transformation and his irrelevance to it. Richard didn't say another word. He fumbled for his car keys, his movements jerky, uncoordinated. He practically fell into the driver's seat, the engine roaring to life with excessive force, shattering the morning calm. He didn't look back as he sped away, leaving behind only the lingering smell of exhaust fumes and the faint impression of expensive tires on the dusty road. I watched him go, not with triumph, but with a profound sense of closure. The final thread connecting me to that old life had just snapped, cleanly and irrevocably. Martha placed a comforting hand on my shoulder. "Well," she said softly, "some tides go out, and they don't come back." Elias nodded in agreement, coiling his rope with quiet finality. The divorce papers were signed and sent off without fanfare. The settlement, when it arrived, was placed into a modest savings account, a safety net perhaps, but not the foundation of my future. My foundation was here, in Saltwind Bay, built with my own hands. My small art pieces continued to sell, gaining a quiet reputation along the coast. I eventually rented a tiny, light-filled space overlooking the harbor, my studio, Amelia's place. It smelled of driftwood, paint, and the sea. It was filled with my creations, works born not of ambition, but of healing and quiet joy. My days found a peaceful rhythm, gathering materials on the beach during low tide, working in my studio, sharing tea and conversation with Martha, listening to Elias's stories, becoming woven ever deeper into the fabric of the community. Success wasn't measured in bank balances or social standing anymore. It was measured in the warmth of friendship, the satisfaction of creation, the feeling of belonging, the quiet hum of contentment in my own heart. Sometimes, looking out at the vast, indifferent beauty of the ocean, I'd reflect on the journey. The shock of Richard's words, the initial terror and despair, the unexpected kindness, the hard-won strength. It was a path I never would have chosen, paved with pain and loss. Yet, somehow, that cruel act of abandonment had become an unintentional gift. It had stripped away the false comfort, the suffocating expectations, and forced me to confront my own resilience, to unearth the dreams I'd buried long ago. Richard's regret had, paradoxically, led me to a life without regret. My future stretched before me, not as a clearly mapped highway, but as an open coastline, full of possibility, shaped by the tides, resilient against the storms, and beautiful in its wild authenticity. I was home. Perhaps you too have faced a moment that felt like the end. Remember that sometimes the most devastating storms clear the path for unexpected sunshine. If my story resonated, perhaps share a thought about where you found strength when you least expected it. The most beautiful shores are often found after navigating the roughest seas.